Thanks, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming to part 2 of our AP Spring workshops. I hope and wish we can be together in person next year, but thanks for being flexible and joining us as you can. We have hopefully something new and beneficial for everyone today. Before we carry on too far, I want to see, is Sarah here with us yet? I can't see all of the participants.
She is not yet, Alex.
Okay. I wanted to introduce you all. If you did not last Friday meet Sarah Orlowski, she is our new College Board representative for the state of New Mexico. But if she's not on the call yet, some of you may be in sessions with her for AP coordinators and for the exam updates for this year. So Joshua, who was our previous representative, has been reassigned to a different region. He's not gone from College Board, so if you have his contact information, I'm sure he'd still answer you. But Sarah is our new point of contact. But if she's not here, we will defer that introduction maybe later this afternoon. We'll have a chance to. Meanwhile, I want to introduce you to today's keynote speaker, and that is Adam Fletcher. He is here. Adam is the CEO of Youth and Educators Succeeding. This is an international nonprofit working to engage students and educators together to transform education. He's also the author of The Guide to Student Voice and more than a dozen other books related to education. Working around K-12 schools for more than 20 years, Adam has been an educator, a researcher, and an advocate whose pioneering projects on the topics of student voice, student engagement, and meaningful student involvement have affected thousands of schools in dozens of states and several nations worldwide. He's keynoted more than 300 conferences, been published in several academic journals and periodicals, and was named a Healthy School Hero by former United States Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher. So we welcome Adam F.C. Fletcher to our advanced placement workshops today. Some of you may have engaged with Adam in some other workshops with REC 9, so we're excited to have him here today. Adam?
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So first, before I get going, I just want to say to you all that I am going to mess around with the format of standing during this online interface. You know, we're so used to sitting, or at least I am. And so if you're a classroom teacher, I'm sure you've already figured this out for yourself. This is maybe the dozenth keynote that I've given in this time. So we'll see how this goes. It'll be interesting. My name is Adam Fletcher, and for more than 25 years, for more than 25 years, I have been working with young people and adults in settings across the United States and around the world, focused on this question of purpose, power, and belonging. In your work with AP students, you know the young people that I'm talking about. However, if you come from any of New Mexico's disparate communities, you also know the other young people that I'm talking about, because this conversation affects every student in every school. We have these old models and these old ways of doing it. And for this keynote, and then in the sessions that I have afterwards, I'm basically going to be pushing the conversation a little bit forward, hopefully with new things that you haven't thought about before. But before I get going, I want to introduce you to myself and tell you really why I'm here. This work for me is very personal. It's nothing that I come in on some gallant horse doing some spectacular thing. This is very deep, and this is very intimate time for me, if only because it comes from my own roots. Growing up, I experienced childhood homeless from the time that I was born until I was about 8 or 9 years old. My father was a Vietnam veteran who struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder his whole life. And I had the opportunity to grow up in rural Canada. Now, I don't know what assumptions you have about rural Canada, but let me just say that there was steer riding in my life when I was 5 years old. I wore cowboy boots and corduroy pants a lot of the places that I went. And I was all about having epaulets on my shirt because I thought that was high fashion. Canada, what? But that said, when my family finally settled down, when we came to our place of being, We got to Omaha, Nebraska. I had 3 siblings, so 4 kids in the backseat of a car with mom and dad in the front and a ferret hidden in the glove compartment. We were border crossers between Canada and the States, and you couldn't carry a ferret across the border. That just wasn't a thing. And so they hid the ferret in the glove compartment while we crossed the border. You get the point. There are other stories like that. And all of that informed my imagination when I was growing up. When we finally landed, we moved to Omaha, Nebraska. Well, we didn't actually move there. I mean, you can imagine how this story works. You're driving from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we're heading towards Kansas City, Missouri, somewhere in the middle of America, right? And along the way, the car breaks down 3 times in a row in Omaha. So that's where I spent the next decade of my life growing up. Because, you know, that's how families choose places to grow up. No, probably not. But you get the story. We moved to this neighborhood initially that was where the poor white folks lived. It was a trailer court down by the river, down by the airport. And my mom didn't want to live there. She wanted to live in a neighborhood with sidewalks and streetlights and curbs, you know, the deluxe things that many towns in New Mexico are missing themselves. When we moved up to the nearest neighborhood. And it took me a few years to understand why it always felt so awkward for me in this neighborhood. It was Omaha's predominantly African-American community. Neighborhood in Omaha, like in a lot of cities across the entire country, blacks are segregated. Black people are segregated and living in one community, like a lot of Latinx, Hispanic folk, and low-income people in general. That segregation, that separation happens. And growing up in this neighborhood, I was the goofy white Canadian kid with a weird accent. I learned how to lose that in order to be an effective border crosser in this different way. Instead of going across the US border to come into the States, I got to go across the racial identity border, as it were. I had an opportunity to go to a magnet high school when I was growing up. However, I didn't go there because I wanted to. I wasn't there for math or science or technology. I was there because it was the neighborhood school and they needed white kids to go to it. And that was part of my experience, was learning how to border cross metaphorically as well as literally. I still have a green card today. I'm still a Canadian citizen, and I'm very proud of my identity and purpose in the world, but it's rounded out because of those initial roots. The feeling and that sense of belonging, or in this case, the lack of belonging, has informed all of my work since. Imagine that you're a young teenager and you decide you're going to spend some part of your life, if not all of it, doing work to challenge the situations that you felt. I felt a lack of belonging where I was being raised, as if I wasn't supposed to be in the place where I lived, where I went to school, and with the people that I was with. I felt a lack of purpose and absence of having a reason, you know, passion. And as a young person, I felt a lack of power. I didn't know the advantage of AP, of honors classes, of National Honor Society, and or International Baccalaureate, or any of it. It was all out of my reach. I didn't get that. But what I did get was one of the community mentors in my community. He worked for a local nonprofit. And one day he came to my house. The guy was 6'4", had these beautiful dreadlocks. And kids came up to him like he was a character on Sesame Street, literally walking down the street. They'd run up to him and, Idu, Idu. He was called Idu Maduli. And Idu was a storyteller in Omaha. They would come up to Idu, Idu, Idu. And they were so excited to see him, including my little sisters. They were in a program that he led every summer that I wasn't really interested in. But regardless, he came to my house and he said to me, Adam, your mom tells me that you're free this summer and I want you to come and work for me. I said, what work, doing what? You know, I'd throw in newspapers and I had mowed lawns and all the things that young teenage boys used to do in the 80s. Edu said to me, I want you to work with me this summer teaching drama. I said, I don't know anything about drama. He says, Adam, you're 14 years old. You know about drama. I said, well, I don't know anything about teaching. He says, come with me this summer and you'll follow me for a few weeks and then you'll get your own class because you'll learn from me how to teach. I said, all right. He offered a paycheck and off I went. I did it. Iduma Dooley taught theater in 7 of Omaha's public housing projects. You know, they were the stereotypic public housing projects that existed in the States from the 1930s through the 90s. These tall apartment buildings packed with humans with extremely low income circumstances, generally seen as suffering depression as an entire community. These weren't happy places, and they didn't have a lot of services, especially in Omaha. But Iduma Dooley brought theater in to teach the kids who had never had a stage before. More than that, though, they never had a voice before. They didn't have that sense of belonging or power or purpose. I spent that summer teaching with Iduma Dooley. He invited me to come back the next 2 summers after and taught and taught and taught. And at the end of the 3rd summer, I decided I wanted to grow up and be just like Idu. So I resigned to the fact that I'm never going to be 6'4". You know, I've capped out at about 5'9". But if you look on your video right now, you'll see I'm growing out my dreadlocks this summer. They're going to be long and beautiful. So I'm going to imagine that you're all laughing at that line right now. It's really important. You get the idea, though. That set the trajectory. That work with Iduma Dooley set the trajectory for the work in the rest of my life. Here I am now. I'm 46 years old. It's been a long time. I'm talking more than 30 years that I've been working with young people and adults in these ways, focused on purpose, power, and belonging. This is my mission. So I'm excited to be here on a lot of reasons, on a lot of levels, not the least of which being that I have recently become the Chief Executive Officer of Youth and Educators Succeeding, this international nonprofit with a 25-year history. There in New Mexico, you actually have a lot of interaction with our nonprofit. However, you might know us by our flagship program. It's called Gen Yes. And for 25 years, Gen Yes has been teaching students how to teach teachers how to use and improve schools with technology. It works in grades 4 through 12 and has been active in more than 100 schools across the state over the last 25 years, including with our good friends at Region 9, who we love. Region 10 is very active, and lots of other places in the state have had Gen Yes before. We're really proud of Gen Yes, and working from that basis, we're expanding the reach of our nonprofit to go even further. I'm here today to share with you this message about what that further looks like. Before I go, though, I want to tell you one other piece. About 20 years ago, back in the 90s, you remember the late 90s? Some of you do. Back in the late 90s, I had a chance through the AmeriCorps National Service Program and the Corporation for National Service to work in Taos with the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, leading service learning programs. And my role was to consult service learning programs with the northern New Mexican pueblos. And in that place at that time, it was a powerful moment for me because I was coming out of those teen years. I was in my mid-20s or moving towards them. And I had a chance to really start to look at a career and see what that meant. The Rocky Mountain Youth Corps and northern New Mexico gave me that footing, that ability to stand on my feet and see the view, literally and metaphorically. The other thing that it did was reconnect me with my family. My dad and older brother moved down to Catherine County. My older brother is actually the elected sheriff of Catherine County right now. And I have been to Reserve quite a bit. I have family and friends down in Gila and in Cliff and also down in Deming. And I love New Mexico. So you have my heart as well as my time today. And I'm really excited to be here and to share this work with you. In addition to Gen Yes, we have 2 other large programs in our nonprofit. One is called the Free Child Institute for Youth Engagement. Inside of this Free Child Institute, we teach young people and adults how to work together to improve communities. It's called Free Child because of an educator named A.S. Neal. He was an English guy back in the 1920s. He started this radical school in the UK. But his premise, his contention was young people were the most free when they're the most responsible for their lives. Young people are the most free when they're the most responsible for their lives. That's why we called it the Free Child Institute. It's to teach responsibility to young people and to teach adults how to support that responsibility. The other program that we have is called Sound Out, and that's where we're driving into today. Sound Out is all about meaningful student involvement, student voice, and student engagement. Let's jump in and take a look at what that actually means. Meaningful student involvement is the idea that young people can experience purpose, power, and belonging throughout every function of the education system for the purpose of building community, building and transforming the education system, and sustaining democracy. Meaningful student involvement is the idea that students can drive schools and all of education, from the local classroom, from your individual classroom on a day-to-day basis, all the way to the state education agency and beyond. Not as passive recipients of adult-led curriculum, assessment, teaching, classroom management, policy making, evaluation, assessment. Not as passive recipients of those things, but instead as active partners throughout the process. Meaningful student involvement takes the young person, and instead of having them be that person who's receiving all of the things that you are sharing, that you are giving to them, it repositions them into new spaces, new places, and new ways for them to affect not just their own learning, but also the education of their peers, the education of their siblings, the engagement of their parents, and our connections to our larger community beyond the school environment. As AP teachers, I bet a lot of you already have a picture in your mind of what that looks like. You all work with young people, with students, with learners, some of whom are really passionate about learning, some of whom have a lot of potential to make a difference. What if we created new opportunities, not for those young people to become more involved because they're already super busy? I'm the father of a 17-year-old daughter. She's a senior in high school right now here in Olympia, Washington, at Olympia High School. My daughter is spectacular. She is a strong, strong learner. She learns with that purpose, passion, and power that we really want to see. She has that sense of belonging. She's also an AP student. She's done several AP classes now. She completed the art AP exam last year, or submission, and received acknowledgement of that. And this year she's doing AP statistics and really enjoying that process. She has that analytical brain that kind of escapes her dad at some points. I know the work that goes into your classrooms from the student's perspective a little bit. But that brings up another important point that I want to make really clear before we go much further. Today, I'm not here as a student, and I'm not here to represent students. Instead, I am here as a fellow adult. I'm here to talk to you as educators. I did my master's work in education leadership and policy studies. I've done all these projects in schools and districts and state agencies for a long time. But I'm not here to represent students. If you really want to find out how students want to be meaningfully involved, you know the answer. Go ask them, especially your AP students who have that aptitude and who've demonstrated that aptitude to think about, to consider, and to otherwise hold up what they can be doing in schools. That said, the awesome thing about meaningful student involvement is that it has room for all learners, not just AP students, but every single student in every single school all of the time. Here's a poster that was made by a group of high school students that I worked with, way last year, back when we used to be a little bit in person. These students, they wanted to promote this idea that all students have voices, and they really latched on to that. They really found that space. Now, they found it for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that they felt left out, that their voices weren't heard. But they also recognized that their brothers and sisters who were younger than them, who might not be on grade level learning, who might not have high levels of aptitude or ability, or have demonstrated those high levels, that they might not even be interested in what goes on in the school. They recognized that their brothers and sisters had voices too. One kid told the story about how his little brother ran out of class one day, took a Sharpie marker out, and he wrote on the locker right next to him, "Mrs. Jones sucks." And then he threw that Sharpie marker into his bag and got snagged by the assistant principal on the way that he was running out the hallway. Guys, I tell that story to you not because it's foreign to me, but rather I resemble that. I had my own circumstances where I wanted to be heard, and I wanted so much for my voice to be heard in schools that I did radical things to be heard. As a high school sophomore, this was back when Earth Day was a celebration that the whole city of Omaha got into. And I decided that I wanted to be involved in Earth Day and in this idea of kids changing the world, making it better. Again, this is back in the 80s, and that wasn't a very popular thing. There was no Greta Thunberg or anybody like that talking about a climate crisis, let alone a young person talking about it. So I went to the science club in my high school, and I said to the teacher, Mrs. Koba, "Hey, Mrs. Koba, can I join the science club? I want to do an environmental project." And Mrs. Koba said that science was for AP students. And since I wasn't an AP student, I couldn't join the science club. So I went to the school principal. I was that kid, I was that student who went to the school principal. I asked for a meeting and I got one. And I went in and sat down with him and I said, "I want a club that all of the students from the neighborhood could join." Remember, this was a low income, predominantly African American neighborhood. And I was a goofy white kid in the middle of it. I said, "I want a club that all the students locally here can join so that we can do projects right here in the neighborhood." And the principal said, "Write that up and see if you can get a teacher to sponsor you. If you can get a teacher to sponsor you, then you can do it." So you know that being a determined 10th grader, I wrote the manifesto of my dreams. It was 2 pages long. Ooh-wee. And taking those 2 pages, I photocopied them at the local church and I brought them to school and I put a copy into every teacher's inbox. There were like 50 or 60 teachers in our high school. And I put a note onto every one of them that said, "Will you please sponsor our club?" Got no responses. So I went to my favorite teachers and I asked them if they would please sponsor a club. None of them wanted to or could commit to it. This went on for a whole school year and no movement happened. I got no traction with this idea. I thought it was pretty witty. I called it the North Environmental Action Team. This was at Omaha North High School. The North Environmental Action Team. You got the acronym? North Environmental Action Team. I thought it was pretty smart. But regardless, I took this idea, this neat idea, and I took it to more teachers and they still didn't buy on. The next school year, I had this giant sheet of cardboard. It was an old box and folded in half like it was a big gift card. And we painted a picture of the earth on the front of it. And we wrote, "Save the planet." I had a couple of my friends helping me out. And then I took it around school. And out of the 2,000 students in my high school, 750 of them signed on to it. And it was just signatures. Nobody said anything mean or nasty or wrong or bad. But I took that to the principal of the high school and I said, "I need this club to happen. We all do." He said, "That's really nice. Go ahead and send out your proposal again." So I sent it out again. I went and did all the rounds. Still didn't get anybody to sign on. So the next year, senior year of high school, you know, you're desperate for a voice. It was March of the year when Earth Day happened. And out of that desperation, my friends and I talked them into this crazy stunt where we jumped into the dumpsters and we went through the trash cans and we collected every pop can that we could find from the high school. And we put it into bags and we tied it up and we put 20 bags of pop cans from one dumpster dive onto the front stairs of the high school before anybody got there for Earth Day. And we put a big sign on front of it that said, "Love the Mother Earth," or some such thing. Well, the principal got there and he saw the mess that I'd made and he said I had to stay after school to pick it up. The mess being these 20 bags of pop cans. And I didn't know what else to do with them. We didn't have a recycling program. There was a Golden Goat about a mile and a half away. Those were the big machines that used to eat pop cans and give you some change. So we ended up calling somebody and their parents took the bags down there. At the end of the school year, we were so desperate for that acknowledgement of this idea that we went and We spray painted all over the outside of the school. This is May of the school year. We spray painted "Love Your Mother Earth" around the outside of the school, and I was suspended for 3 days because of that. And that is my story of unmeaningful student involvement. I'm sure that all of you have your own version of that. If not for yourself, then students that you've taught. If not for the students that you've taught, then maybe the kids that you've known in the past. But in some way, you know those voices that aren't heard. These students who I was working with last year, they were determined that all students should be heard. There's lots of ways to listen to student voice. There's lots of ways that student voice fits into meaningful student involvement. So when we think about the systemic opportunities for students to have voices and to be involved in meaningful ways, what does that practically look like? In my breakout sessions, I'm going to talk about these nuances, and we're going to get into some of the different effects of student voice and of student engagement. But I want you all to hold in your imaginations right now the students who you know who have great amounts of leadership skills already. You know, they're the ones who communicate and who problem solve. They're the ones who are team builders and they work really well in collaboration with other students. Now I want you to imagine them partnering with you as an educator to deliver curriculum. I want you to imagine them partnering with your school building leader to figure out restorative justice for your entire building. I want for you to imagine these students having opportunities to be on the district school board, not just as passive observers, not just as token students set up like puppets to say the things that adults want to hear, but instead as passionate, powerful, and purposeful contributors acting in partnership with those school board members to make sure that the decisions made about students that affect students are made with students. I put up a photo here of students working on a collaborative game. Some of you might know this, but they're working together to show and to illustrate this idea that students aren't just in a laboratory. They're not just in a laboratory trying to figure stuff out. They're not in a museum that's all stagnant and staid. Instead, they're in this creative, iterative space where they are capable of imagining and creating the future in real time. In our nonprofit program, Gen Yes, we have students who are working in real time to help teach classes with teachers. They're helping teachers learn about technology. And this is what meaningful student involvement is all about. Not just for the AP students, not just for the bad kids, but for every student in every school to have these opportunities. Now, when we say meaningful student involvement, I want to differentiate it from the other thing. It's kind of a dichotomy. Maybe if you're a drawer, if you're a person who takes graphic notes, you might draw a picture of this in your bullet journal. But imagine a spectrum. And on the left side of the spectrum, it says meaningful student involvement. On the right side of the spectrum, it says unmeaningful student involvement. Non-meaningful student involvement, you get the idea. What I want you to do is to imagine how to move from one type to the other. Think for yourself, what does that mean to move from one type of meaningful student involvement to the other? What I'd like everybody to do right now is jump into the chat and drop for me in the chat right now one type, one activity that you think would be a kind of meaningful student involvement. What have you seen or what can you imagine that would help students build their commitment to education, that would help students transform democracy, that would help students feel community? Drop for me an activity into the chat. I would love to see those come in. Tracy said student council. Jorge said journalism. Shauna said anything they can take ownership over. I would love for you to expand on that. Give me some more. The school newspaper, peer review. Excellent examples. Keep coming. Town hall meetings. What increases, think about purpose, power, and belonging. What increases the purpose of students? What increases the power of students? What increases the belonging that students experience? Op-eds, National Honor Society, composting program at school, project-based learning, graduates coming back to mentor younger students, helping, organizing, and leading our writing center, the school magazine, the recycling program, strong teacher relationships, peer-to-peer help, writing a letter of recommendation, recommending specific action to the school's administration about something they care about, gardening at school, beautifying their campus, love and acceptance, being believed in, which Loretta, thank you for that. Loretta starts to get into this other piece of this puzzle, because we're thinking about these really structural or classroom activities, and those are super important, but we need more than just that structure, more than just those formal things, the food drives and the peer counseling and getting solar put onto campus. All those are valid, thank you. And what are the feelings that students need? What are the sense of what goes on around them and within them to support them being meaningfully involved? Here's another way to look at that. As a teacher, as an educator, as a school leader, whatever your role is, what can you do for students on a personal level to make sure that they are meaningfully involved? Manuel, thank you for saying immigration issues. So drop in the chat for me. What's one thing that you as a teacher or school leader or whatever your role is, what's one thing you can do to meaningfully involve a student personally? So beyond the structures, beyond the activities, somebody had said love and acceptance. Sanford says listen to them. Darcy says accept feedback and input on coursework. Work with them directly. Thank you, Terry. Take an interest in things they care about. Be their cheerleader. Allow students to have voice and choice. Mentor them. Provide them with the best instruction you can. Listen to student input. Ask them questions. Provide leadership opportunities. Guys, you're pouring these in here. It's as if you are already meaningfully involving students. So now I want you to think about and to move with me through this space. We've talked about these structures. We've talked about these activities that you personally can do. Now let's get to this thing right here. What is that thing? There is something that stops students from being meaningfully involved. There are barriers that stop students that are just there, the brakes for meaningful student involvement. What stops meaningful student involvement? I want to tell you 3 primary barriers to why meaningful student involvement doesn't exist already. And these aren't going to be news to you, but I want you to think about them specifically for meaningful student involvement. The first barrier that I want to acknowledge is that students themselves can be barriers to meaningful student involvement. That's right, you know it. If you're a high school teacher, you already know that students have been conditioned and taught for 9 or 10 years before they get to you how to behave and act in schools. They have had their assumptions checked. They have had their prospects dimmed. They have had their hopes deflated sometimes. And they can be barriers to meaningful student involvement, students themselves. They do this in 3 primary ways. One way that they do it is they resist meaningfulness. You know what I'm talking about. What does it look like when students resist meaningful involvement? Give me some ideas in the chat again, please. What does it look like when students resist meaningful involvement? Jump right in there, drop some ideas. Darcy says it looks like transactional education. Jump through hoops, receive the grade. What does it look like when students resist meaningful involvement? Give me some ideas. Anybody jump in there, don't be shy. Thank you, Irene. They don't talk. Plain old resistance. Lack of interest, they check out. Bye-bye. And we can see that with this camera more than ever before, perhaps. Teacher-led instruction, actively hindering others from involvement, turning off their cameras, closing down, misbehaving. In the next session that I lead, it's on student engagement, and we're going to peel this a little bit more, but students themselves can be barriers. So resistance is one way. Another way that students can be barriers to meaningful involvement is that they can parrot. I say that cautiously because AP teachers know what I'm talking about. When students parrot what adults say or they say what adults want to hear, they're actually acting in resistance to meaningful involvement. Thank you, Sanford. You just said superficial conversation, just waiting for the bell. That parroting is part of that. Then the third way, so first is resistant, blatant resistance, saying no. Second is parroting. Third is testing. And y'all know what students testing looks like. Not when you're testing them, but when they're testing you. They're testing you to find out if you can meaningfully involve them. You say, hey, well, let's do something radical around the school. What would that be? And they say, let's burn it down and start over again. We'll build it out of rocks and recycled material. And your job as a responsible adult is to say, no, I don't think so. Unfortunately, a lot of educators think that their job is to say, okay, sure, and then never do it. Some of you know what I'm talking about. So all of these things considered, that's student resistance to meaningful involvement. And that is one of 3 forms. Guess what the other 2 are? The second one is systemic barriers to meaningful involvement. You know, the system, the big thing that employs us all, the big thing that makes sure that these students have opportunities to learn, to be involved in the first place. It turns out that that system can limit the possibilities for student involvement. So again, brainstorm with me. Come back into that chat and tell me one way that the system stops students from being meaningfully involved. Just jump right in there. What is one way that the school system stops meaningful student involvement? Books that are written by old white men. Absolutely. What's another way that the system defeats meaningful student involvement? Stereotypes. Thank you. What else? Focus on testing instead of real learning. A lack of support. Never reading student work regardless of the audience. Common Core. Reliance and emphasis on GPA. Not allowing the bullying club to be developed. Unable to relate to the curriculum. Preference for sports and athletics only. Woo, these are heavy. Give me some more. Unable to relate to the curriculum. Thank you for that. And that's for so many reasons. It might be culturally unaware. It might be white supremacist. It might be classist. Additionally, it might not be applicable. It might not have any real world applications that students can relate to or that are taught to them by educators. Inequality for opportunities. Opportunities for low-income students deliberately to participate in AP. Opportunities for non-white learners to become student leaders, capital S, capital L. A lack of technology. Has that ever been more glaring than right now? One of my favorite schools in New Mexico is in Hatch. Props to anybody who's here from Hatch. And one of my favorite teachers is there as well. And she has told me the story of how the houses in her district, the students at home in her district, they will lose the internet when the weather changes because they're in a valley and it messes up the signal, the internet signal. Talk about technology, talk about digital divide. The lack of mentorship with a community leader or teacher. All of these things, these systemic effects, affect meaningful student involvement. But I want to get real about this because we've said that students can be barriers to meaningful student involvement. We've said that the system can be barriers to meaningful student involvement. Let's get to the third form. And the third form of a barrier to meaningful student involvement is, ladies and gentlemen, I'm presuming everybody here is an adult, so I'm going to go ahead and point the finger at you and me. We, adults, are barriers to meaningful student involvement. Now, I know. It's easy to be like, well, that's actually the system. The system made me do it. The system made me do it. But some of you all have figured out how to overcome the system in many circumstances to make your classes meaningful already, to make involvement in your classes meaningful. Those of you who have figured that out, raise your hand. Oh, I'm joking. But you know what I'm talking about. There are in this group right now, in this conference right now, in this training activity, there are teachers who at the beginning of the school year memorize the name of every single one of their students all day long. Whether you have 28 students or 128 students, you intentionally sought to memorize their names. That is meaningful involvement. It's not the deepest, it's not the most beautiful. It might even be called superficial. But that act of memorizing the names, attaching something of purpose to them, and allowing these students to have an identity beyond being Joey in my math class, that is meaningful. When we don't do that, though, when we aren't actively meaningfully involving students, we are inherently non-meaningfully involving students. I'm going to say that again because it bears the need to be repeated, because sometimes I don't say things clear. When we don't meaningfully involve students on purpose, we are generally non-meaningfully involving students. Does that mean that every student has to be meaningfully involved every day in every way possible, everywhere, all the time? Absolutely not. That is not a realistic expectation. That's not a hope worth hoping, because no point in our life do we experience 100% meaningfulness all the time. And if you do, I want to A, know you, and B, know what that is. I really love biking. I love bicycling. One of the best rides that I ever took was from Cliff to Silver on the highway right after they tarred it. It was ridiculous. I had tar up my back. It was way too hot that day, but the memory will stay with me for all my life because I love bicycling. But are there times when bicycling stinks? Absolutely. Are there times when it's not meaningful to me? Absolutely. Same thing in your classes. You might be the most passionate teacher. You might have the most purposeful classes. You might build that sense of belonging with students like nobody else. And there are days when teaching isn't meaningful. Same thing with students. There are times when involvement is not going to be meaningful. It's just not. That said, what I want to unpack now, and what I would like you to drop into the chat, is how do you specifically, you, Joey, Susie, Sharice, Juan, any of you, drop into the chat for me. How do you act as a barrier to meaningful student involvement sometime? Now, if you can't think of a way that you do that specifically, think of the teacher in the next classroom over, whatever you got to do. Tell me how adults are barriers to meaningful student involvement. Name it, drop it into the chat, please. Give me one example. Alex says, I can't deeply engage with all 180 of my students, therefore I can't engage with any of them. Teaching by rote memorization. Teacher-led instruction. I don't have enough time. Shut down emotionally. Exhaustion. And 4 preps. Following policy. Overloading. I had to cover the content on the test. Teaching to the test. Taking personally any issue with students. So many changes recently. Too many worksheets. Thinking that youth problems aren't real problems like adults have. Getting angry when social and emotional learning might be more meaningful. Covering dual classes. This goes on, guys. I bet your list could be miles long on this part, especially because as conscientious educators, you know where you're at. You know what you're doing. To me, to my way of thinking, this conversation matters as much, if not more, than anything else in schools today. And I'm going to go so far as to say that your next school year will be contingent upon meaningful student involvement. This student wrote this sign before the pandemic. Take a look at that. Student voice matters because we hold the future. What she didn't anticipate 2 years ago was that the future is happening right now, not in a hypothetical way, but in a very real way. Imagine having all of that self space during the pandemic as a learner. Imagine, put yourself in your 17-year-old shoes. Give yourself that ability to see your teacher through your computer, no matter how long ago that was. If it was 5 years ago and you're a young teacher, more power to you. If it was 25 years ago and you're getting to be an older person like myself, imagine your response to the pandemic. Folks, I don't need to tell you, but I'm going to anyway. Next year is going to be hard. Not even the end of this school year, because if they got back full time by the end of the school year, out of hybrid, all the way into school, we're going to kind of, we're going to flex with that, and it's going to be what it is. But next year, these students are going to need to experience purpose, because they had that purpose all year long this year. Their purpose was to survive the pandemic. Their purpose was to stay out of mom and dad's hair or stay out of trouble. Their purpose was to stay focused on class. Even if they didn't do that, they still had a purpose. They had more. They could turn off their cameras. They could even fake being on the computer. Sometimes they didn't even bother to show up for class. They had power all year long. Oh yeah, what's that third one again? Belonging. Every young person. And bless the ones who don't have that space, because I relate to it. You heard my story. Every young person who has a home has that sense of belonging. And for 1 year of their school life, they belonged like they never had in school before. Every student, except perhaps the homeless. They experience that sense of belonging, especially your AP students. Next year, you have to transform the way you're teaching. And I'm going to suggest to you, student voice matters, not just because we hold the future, said this student, but student voice matters because the future is happening right now. The next school year is going to be phenomenal. You're going to knock it out of the park, and it's going to be great beyond all measure. And you're going to need ways to do that. My breakout sessions today, one is called Authentic Student Engagement. Different from meaningful student involvement. I'll explain it when you get there. The other one's called Student Voice in Action. If you need more resources, if you want to learn more about meaningful student involvement, check out soundout.org. We have social media around soundout at soundout.org. Our organizational website is yesk12.org. You can learn about Gen Yes there. You can learn about the Free Child Institute for Youth Engagement. You can learn about SoundOut. You can follow us on the socials with that, with YesK12 Official. My name's Adam Fletcher. I want to thank you all so much for coming to this opening address, and I hope to see you all in my subsequent breakout session. Thanks, guys. And I hand the mic back over.
Thank you, Adam. We appreciate it. Awesome presentation as usual. And everyone, we will take a 10-minute break. When we come back, if you were here last week, you kind of know the drill. If not, we will go into breakout sessions. These sessions will be chosen by you. And so once you get in here in about 10 minutes, we'll start a little bit early. That way we can get you guys into your sessions. I have some instructions to share with you. Also in the chat, there is a quick survey. If you'll take a couple minutes to fill that out, it's very fast. And you will receive a certificate for attending this training. If you have any questions, of course, reach out. Thank you, and we will see you in about 10 minutes.